In the various editions of Dungeons & Dragons, there are a few spells as iconic as the Fireball spell. In 5th edition, it's one of the most overpowered spells for its level versus damage output, and it's an overpoweredness that's been done on purpose. It's also one of the few spells to essentially stay the same in both the level you gain it and the spirit of the rules. But what made it iconic and what makes it special today? Today, we're going to cast Detect Magic on Fireball, and look at the structure of the spell, the rules, the history, the idea behind it all. We'll also look at ways to expand upon it and how it can affect the world around it. Welcome to the philosophy of the Fireball. The Fireball spell was first introduced in a game that preceded D&D, a set of rules for the Lord of the Rings wargame created in 1970 by Leonard Patt. Patt won an award for the rules and compiled them into a small booklet. I don't know why I felt I had to include that useless small booklet fact, but that booklet has this to say of casting a fireball. Wizards in possession of magic powers can cast a fireball once every other turn. The distance is 24 inches and the hit is determined using a 6-inch grid with a 2.5-inch burst circle. Any figures under the burst are killed except heroes and anti-heroes, who are saved by a throw of a 5 or 6. A dragon hit by a fireball is driven away and will not attack the wizard side for 1 turn. I don't know why I did the accent there. I kind of do, it's Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is very English. Anyway, Fireball was also found in the 1971 chainmail rules with the same 24-inch maximum distance before detonation but a 3.5-inch diameter. The creator of chainmail maintains that Fireball was in the original edition of chainmail and therefore predated D&D altogether, although at the time Gary Gygax noted that the rules and dimensions exactly matched that of a heavy catapult's attack, so maybe he considered it a poor mimicry and not a true spell description. The original D&D was a more fantasy-inspired version of chainmail, and the spell Fireball was added in 1974 with the same 24-inch spell distance but with a slightly larger 4-inch diameter. The PHB of 1st edition clarifies that 1 inch of indoors combat equals 10 feet, and outdoors combat equal 10 yards. In a confined space, the 1st edition Fireball would conform to the shape of the space, meaning that if the space was a long tunnel, then the Fireball would stretch forward and back. Rather than an area of fire, it was a volume of fire. If you were a wizard casting this, you had to be very sure you were in a large enough space. The 1st edition Fireball dealt d6's worth of damage, equal to the level of the caster, and Fireball was 2 words. The spell level it could be cast at was 3rd, and Gygax often ruled in his own games that the spell would burn unattended magical items and melt unguarded treasure such as gold or silver. If you have ever had a DM who these days gleefully describes how the gold sounds as it drips down the grate in the middle of the room, just know that you are part of a long tradition dating back to the very beginning of the game. The AD&D Fireball was much the same as the first, but both simplified and traditions made codified. Simplified because the range to maximum detonation was now 100 feet plus 1 foot per caster level, and answered any questions that people may have had about sudden pressure changes. It didn't do that. That maximum range was also the same regardless of inside or outside. But codified because Gygax's tradition of destroying your treasure was written into the spell description. To wit, and I'm not doing an American accent, besides causing damage to creatures, the fireball ignites all combustible materials within its burst radius, and the heat of the fireball will melt soft metals such as gold, copper, silver, etc. Items exposed to the spell's effects must be rolled for to determine if they are affected. Items with a creature which makes its saving throw are considered as unaffected. The spell also created a streak of fire that then exploded at the desired destination, but could pre-explode if there was something in the way. Walls of force or other such invisible but tangible barriers could be the bane to a wizard, and illusions of such barriers were a cheap way of restricting the firebug casters. People caught within the fireball could save for half damage, though often that wouldn't protect the caster, seeing as they usually had such low HP. The damage was still a d6 per level of the caster, and it would still conform to the original volume of the spell within any such space it was cast. The AD&D books described this volume as 33 10 by 10 by 10 foot cubes. It was monstrously huge, and probably explains the dread the average D&D player was supposed to feel whenever Fizban the Marvelous, from the Dragonlance books, would inevitably say, "Aha! This seems like the perfect time to cast my favourite spell, Fireball! Now where is my book?" Note that he'd be usually saying this in cramped conditions underground, or once when he was falling. The AD&D Fireball also introduced the material component of a tiny ball composed of bat guano and sulfur. In real-world history, bat guano was mined for its ability to easily create saltpeter, which in turn could be used to create gunpowder when combined with sulfur and carbon. A tiny ball of guano and sulfur was the perfect material metaphor for creating a powerful spell of explosive fire. The second edition of AD&D put a cap on the fireball damage at 10d6. In 3rd edition, the fireball was still 3rd level, still 1d6 per caster level, low sound, no pressure, and melted treasure. The thematics changed a tiny bit. Instead of being a flash then a ball of fire, it was a pea-sized sphere of fire being thrown out to at least half a mile of maximum distance, and that pea could explode if it hit something in the way or hit its intended distance. Like a super concentrated grenade. Or, like in Chainmail, watching the catapult rock sailing through the air before it actually hit. Gone was the need to plan out the 33 cubes of fire that the spell could supposedly fill, as the spell became an area of effect rather than a volume of effect. But that area could still creep around corners and barriers, and there was a diagram to help clarify that. And if the character wanted to fire the pea through a narrow opening, say through an arrow slit or even under a door or the like, then they had to succeed on a ranged touch attack, or else the pea hit it and the fireball exploded immediately. It was up to the DM to determine the armor class of such a feat. The 4th edition Fireball was vastly simplified, but retained a lot of the point of it from previous editions. It only did 3d6 damage, plus your intelligence modifier, which was definitely a downgrade, but it was still available to wizards at level 5. It had a 20 square range, which was still massive, with a large burst affecting everyone within 3 squares of the detonation square. The thing about 4th edition is that its main focus was damage and combat. I found the lack of roleplay specific rules actually quite rewarding because there were few recourses for players to diminish social and environmental encounters by quoting rules at me. But I can see how that can be a downside as well, especially if you have a tyrannic DM. But the problem with making a streamlined game that focused on combat was that some iconic spells were going to be balanced. And Fireball was given a huge range in AoE, but it had a low damage as a result, especially for being a daily power. I think that was a mistake, because we're already so far removed from normal D&D. I think keeping the Fireball spell less balanced would have made people accept 4th edition at least a little bit more. Fortunately, in 5th edition that focus on balance was lessened. We took some great ideas from 4th edition and put them in the latest iteration, but we also honoured traditions and made a Fireball spell that's like a homage of the previous editions. The spell range is a set 150 feet, a good compromise between 3rd edition and 4th. It's got the primitive gunpowder material component, it sets unattended flammable things on fire but not metals, and it does a lot more damage than other spells of its level, at a set 8d6. In 5th edition we also lost the caster level requirement, instead focusing on the spell level it's cast at. And we could continue saving for half. Fireball was always OP in some way, be it by range or volume or damage, but it always hit allies as well as enemies, or made you lose treasure. that OP is on purpose. It's an iconic spell, one of the spells that really makes the game, and I think the designers knew that. It's there to encourage you to choose this symbol of D&D rather than spells of the same level that just don't do quite as much damage. It's a good and early way to make a caster feel powerful. Remember, although it's best for a large group of enemies, don't be afraid to use it on solo monsters. Dealing 8d6 damage in a single round is still a great source of damage, and it can scare some DMs into using up one of those precious legendary saves. Fireballs can be aimed off-center. You don't get any less or more damage based on how much of a monster is engulfed, so if a monster towers over the party, you're welcome to say that it exploded just above it so that the head is affected and your allies aren't. Just remember that creatures have resistance to fire when completely submerged in water, and allies will also be affected when they're in the area of effect. 5th edition gives us a couple of ways to officially get the best results from the spell. An Evocation Mage gains the ability to sculpt spells so that some or all allies are unaffected, and the Elemental Adept feat lets you take your fire spells and have them ignore spell resistance, but also lets you change any ones you rolled on damage into 2s. It doesn't sound like much, but you're effectively doubling the damage you rolled on those dice, and ensures that creatures who make their saving throws are hurt just that little bit more. Remember also that you can always talk to your DM and maybe they can give you a feat that will improve the fireball experience. A lot of DMs are really not going to be into that. There are many creatures out there though, resistant or immune to fire. In 3rd edition there were feats called Energy Substitution or Energy Admixture, which respectively let you change the energy type of a spell to another one, or let you add a further half of the damage rolled to a separate energy type. It might be possible to get a similar one for 5th edition, though I would suggest that stick to elemental damage, since something like a Force Ball would be more of a OP spell than normal, and the Bright Queen might have words about your unauthorized use of Dunamancy. Finally, DMs. My gaming group has a universal rule. There is always a fracking mage. And you should take note. Fireball can be an incredible way, especially at low level, to really instill a sense of mortal fear in a group. The high range and the large spread means that the spell can be cast even off the battle grid, and the mage can easily escape before a vengeful player or character can get close enough to retaliate. It's also outside of a counterspell or dispel magic range. But be warned. While it's fair and reasonable to use Fireball on monsters, it's not fair nor reasonable in the minds of the players to cast it multiple times at them. Players don't often have a choice in their positioning and don't often have a way to spread out quickly. It can also suck the fun out of a game if you cast it near the end of a battle when HP and morale are already both so low. If you want a fight to shift from the Wizard of Oz, where everyone good is going to live, to Serenity, where at any moment a character could suddenly be a leaf on the wind, it's oftentimes a great spell to start a combat, but in my experience it's a terrible one to end it. And as always, you're the DM. What you do with your game is usually the best decision you can make. If we're looking at how Fireball can affect the world holistically, I came up with a couple of ideas. I mean, one is just a repeat of the idea I stole from AJ. The spell creates fire, and like often attracts like in the D&D world. It's not difficult to assume that fire-based elementals, or maybe even demons or devils, could be attracted to places where such a spell is repeatedly cast. Or cold-based creatures or water-based creatures could come to tell off the party. If your campaign world has planar instability or weak barrier energy, it's a great way to caution casters who like to use the spell while not banning it outright. I would likely make it a 30% chance to summon a CR creature equal to half the caster's level, rolled on the second Fireball onwards, and cast in the same hour of the first. A good way to signal this possibility ahead of time would be to describe the environment as being particularly parched, prone to fire, or even to just describe that sort of rush of dry wind, as though the forest or whatever area around them were taking a deep, indrawn breath just before the forest firestorm hits. Indeed, this sort of occurrence can be used as a lair whose actions rely on the decisions of the party, rather than activating at initiative 20. The other holistic thing to keep in mind is much more mundane, but unattended objects that can burn still catch on fire. While an item might not itself be flammable, the individual pieces might. If an intricate iron-bound chest is in the explosion, then that wood will burn, even if the other pieces don't. If you're a rare DM, admittedly, and actually use art pieces as treasure, then that expensive painting or book is going to go up in flames. Players should probably get the ability to put fires out. Maybe it takes an action or a bonus action if they have access to a PG fluid. Do the players save the healing potion, or the 500 gold piece painting? The Fireball spell is meant to be overpowered for the level, but it makes up for that with a large area of effect and a not inconsequential secondary ability. Casting it should always come with hesitation, and I think a good game will always give players pause before casting it, but reward clever positioning, thinking, or even the occasional, to heck with it. Thank you for listening to this in-depth investigation of the philosophy of the Fireball spell. I hope your day goes well, and until next time, kia pai tō rā.